Today, I'm going to get into and talk about the Cold War era, which starts really right after World War II in the late 1940s. Of course, it goes up to like around 1991. It's about when they think kind of ends when the Soviet Union collapses. And so that's most of what we'll be talking about off and on pretty much from the 1940s of the president and other domestic stuff that happens too in the United States as well. So anyway, I do have a new PowerPoint lecture for this period that we do have. So I kind of have a date on it, you see there. It's kind of a debate about when the Cold War starts, but usually anywhere from 1945 to about 47 or 48 is usually about when it ends. And I guess the end date varies, but either ended in 1989 or really it should be 1991. That's probably really when it really ended because that's when the Soviet Union collapsed in December of 91. Right, let me get, of course, into the Cold War and talk about, of course, today some of the background of it. I think some of we've kind of already talked about before, but you remember correctly, I talked about how at the end of World War II, Harry S. Truman became president because Franklin D. Roosevelt died in office April of 1945. And so Truman was the one that, of course, helped end World War II by, dropping the 2 atomic bombs on Japan. And so he ended up being in office from 1945 to 1953. Pretty much finished, I guess he was in office about 7 years or so, roughly. And they call him Harry S. Truman. He's from Missouri, if you know about this, but Truman didn't really have a middle name. He just kind of invented it. So Harry Truman was his real name, but he just kind of added the S later. So it doesn't really stand for anything. So he would come in and succeed FDR. Now you think it's under his, when he's in office, Truman, that the Cold War era began at the time. So it starts, they think, sometime really in, I guess, Truman's first administration there, that he's in power. And the Cold War era was this period that was between like the United States and their allies in the West. And of course, you had the Soviet Union and their allies in the East. And kind of talk about what the Cold War was. It was mostly a geopolitical struggle between these two sides. It wasn't really a war. It was kind of like a Cold War where they maybe had some hot conflicts here and there that broke out, throughout the world, like Korea or Vietnam. But in a sense, it was more like a standoff between both sides. And it almost caused World War III to break out several times from the 1950s to, I think, up to the 1980s, more or less. And basically, you had two sides pitted against each other. You had those on one side in the West that were called the Western Bloc. And these were mostly democratic capitalist countries like the United States, Britain, France, Canada, West Germany, etc. And the nations that were communist in the East were part of the Eastern Bloc countries like Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, etc. And the thing that's very famous about the Cold War is that it created an arms race, a nuclear arms race, of course, between basically the two main superpowers, United States and, of course, Soviet Union, which proliferated for years. And it created a lot of fear and tension throughout the Cold War. And so there was this fear that there would be nuclear war that would break out. And so people thought that World War III would eventually, of course, come. And starting on Truman, they think the Cold War started. It does go all the way up to Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush's administration, which I think actually the date of when they usually end the Cold War is 1991. when the Soviet Union actually collapsed. Now, let me get into, of course, and talk about some of the causes of why, of course, the Cold War started. Now, one of them is the UN. The United Nations did kind of help to actually create the Cold War. If you know about the United Nations, it was this international government peace organization similar to the League of Nations that basically replaced it after the war ended. And it was the Allied powers that started it. They created it, and they were hoping to use this United Nations to basically create peace, harmony, and prevent wars from breaking out. And the idea was to use diplomacy to prevent warfare and, talk differences between each other to prevent that. The UN was originally founded in San Francisco, in California, where the winning Allied powers met there. And eventually, over time, they moved the actual headquarters of the United Nations to New York City. And you can see in that picture, that's the United Nations building, which is, of course, still there today. That became its headquarters. And that the five main countries that founded the United Nations were often later called the Big Five: United States, Great Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. Those are, of course, the five that are still, of course, involved in it. And they also created this thing called the Security Council, which was an apparatus that was developed by the five permanent members, the Big Five. I just told you, U.S., Britain, France, China, and Soviet Union. It also had 10 alternating countries. So every year they would put 10 other countries with the other five. So there's actually 15 on the Security Council every year. And of course, the Security Council's main job was to enforce a lot of the policies of the United Nations. But some people see the United Nations as a kind of a rubber stamp and doesn't really sometimes prevent conflicts from breaking out. And some people don't like the UN. I know the United States, there's some people that wish we wouldn't even support it sometimes. Now, all five members of the Big Five I told you about, which U.S., Britain, France, China, and Soviet Union, later Russia, of course, have veto power, where they could veto each other or certain resolutions, so they could do things like that. And they think that actually helped to contribute to the Cold War conflict because you had a deal during the Cold War where basically the United States, Britain, and France would be on one side, with the so-called Western Bloc countries. Then the USSR, with, of course, Communist China later, would be on the other. So that created a lot of tensions. And there's a lot of cases where they would veto each other and things like that. The UN did get involved in some early issues after it formed. I guess the two main things they got involved in that were kind of famous was dealing with Israel, because what happened was the British Empire for years had occupied Palestine. And they decided to create this idea of a peace plan where they would create two separate states, one a Jewish state in Palestine and one an Arab state, which the Jews agreed to. And that led to the creation of the state of Israel. Of course, the Arabs didn't agree to it. And so it sparked the Arab-Israeli wars. So it's kind of something they helped to kind of spark, more or less. And also, they got involved in the early 1950s in the Korean War conflict, where they supported South Korea, from being conquered by North Korea. That mostly involved the United States that intervened. So a lot of times in some of these conflicts, we have to end up putting a lot of our forces in there. But other countries also put up forces today because the UN has some kind of military forces, kind of like NATO does, but it's not as big, though. Mostly used for peace concessions and stuff like that. Right, let me get into and talk about, of course, the issues that really caused the the Cold War really to begin. I need to, of course, talk about that because there's a lot of different issues that really caused the Cold War to really start, more or less. I don't have it all in that slide, but I want to go back and talk about, because I didn't really get into and talk about what happened. The origins of the Cold War go all the way back to the Russian Revolution, which started in 1917. And what happened was in Russia, the Russian Empire under Emperor Nicholas II got overthrown by the Russians. What happened was over time, by the end of 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power. Who were they? They were basically these radical communists that came to power under Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin went on to eventually help establish the Soviet Union in 1922, which was also called the USSR. And so that was like one of the main things that started a lot of the tensions between, I guess, us and of course Soviet Union later when it formed. And they never trusted us. Part of why was because I think when the Soviet Union formed, they had a civil war, the Russian Civil War, and we actually backed what they call the White Russians against the Red Russians, which were communist. So we tried to actually support military sides that were against them, and so they didn't trust us much after that for a long time. Although in World War II, they kind of began to trust us because they needed military aid. But Stalin, I don't think, ever trusted the West, basically. And then in America, they had all this, like the first Red Scare, they had the second Red Scare, and all that. And so a lot of people really didn't trust the Soviet Union. They thought they were trying to take over the world and spread communism and all that. And that's what happened, after World War II ended. If you know about Eastern Europe basically got taken over by the Soviets, who spread communism to all those countries. So communism went into Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Albania, Romania, Bulgaria, also Yugoslavia as well. And in 1946, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain, came to America, and he gave a speech in what is Missouri, which Truman was there. And Churchill said a comment in that speech that basically was going on in Europe. He said the famous quote, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." And what he was talking about was the idea that Eastern Europe was going all communist, and that those people didn't really have any rights democratically, no more capitalism for them if they had it. And so that basically was something that was the beginning of the differences between East and West. And maybe some people think that that's maybe around when the Cold War, really gets started at that point. The Cold War began in different parts of Europe, of course. And of course, one area that, of course, became very famous where the Cold War really started was Germany. If you know about Germany, it was occupied after the war, after we defeated the Nazis. And the four major powers that won the war, which were France, United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, occupied it and then divided it up, including Berlin, which was also divided as well. Now, I do have a picture of that to show you a map of kind of like the different Germany and the post-war Germany and how it was actually divided up, which you can see there. And so you can see that basically Germany was divided into four different sectors. What they call West Germany became basically the areas in green, orange, and blue, which were occupied by Britain, France, and of course the United States. And the red area was occupied by the Soviet Union in what they called later East Germany. I'll put these on the screen for you as well. So they're basically put these in the different occupation zones. So the Western Allies occupied the three zones in the West, later called West Germany. And the Soviet Union occupied the fourth zone, which became East Germany over time. Of course, they had different names, which I'll explain to you, but West Germany became later capitalistic in democratic versus East Germany, which became communist. And what's crazy about what happened to Germany was they took East Germany, the capital of Berlin, well, the city of Berlin, and they divided it into 4 sectors as well. So West Berlin was controlled by France, Britain, and the US, and then East Berlin was controlled by the Soviet Union. And later on in the 1960s, starting around 1961, you'll see later that the Soviets in East Germany will later build the Berlin Wall, which will be built to separate East Berlin from West Berlin and prevent people from escaping to the West, which is why they built it. I'll explain that later, not now. Oh, and these are their real names. West Germany was actually originally called the Federal Republic of Germany, 1949, 1990, of course, around. And East Germany was called the German Democratic Republic, basically. Same years, of course, but most people just call it West and East Germany, if you know that for sure. Now, of course, the other thing that happened too at the beginning of the Cold War was that they started having problems with communism starting to spread all over the place. And one of the first places threatened by communism was, of course, Greece and Turkey. In Eastern Europe and Western Asia, they became threatened by it. There were actually, I think, communist guerrillas, or I guess, were trying to take over those countries. And so the United States sent economic and military aid to help both those countries to prevent them from, I guess, going communist, basically, and get them back on their feet after World War II. We sent something like $400 million in aid to help them out. And what happened was, because of us helping, Greece and Turkey, this led eventually to what they called the Truman Doctrine. They called it. And the Truman Doctrine was this idea of U.S. diplomat George Kennan. He kind of came up with the idea. And that was the idea to try and contain communism from spreading, like throughout the world. And that's what the Truman Doctrine was. So it was this U.S. policy to try and contain the spread of communism throughout the world. And so we came up with the idea to eventually give, economic aid to people. And so they believed that the aid to Greece and Turkey then led into what later became known as the Marshall Plan, which was first developed in 1948 and 1951. Its original name was actually called the Economic Recovery Plan. The U.S. spent something like $13 billion on trying to help Western Europe, like rebuild and so on. It was also done to help prevent the spread of communism throughout the region as a whole. So including any countries like, pretty much any countries in the West could get money, I think, from this, like Britain, France, Italy, West Germany, Austria, etc. I guess any country affected by the war could get money from it. And it was called Marshall Plan because it was named after President Truman's Secretary of State, who was George C. Marshall. Marshall was actually a famous general in World War II under FDR's government. And he later won the Nobel Peace Prize for this idea. The Marshall Plan, its support and development and giving aid to different parts of Europe. What's funny about the whole thing is that we offered it to also Eastern Europe, like Eastern Germany and all that, and Soviet Union and all those other countries in the East. But Joseph Stalin refused to go along with it. He wouldn't take any money from us. And he called it Yankee imperialism, I think was the comment he said about it. So he refused to have anything to do with that. And so tensions began to grow even more, between us and them. Then there was another incident that happened in 1948-49, they think, that helped to cause the beginning of the Cold War. And that was, of course, the famous Berlin blockade that followed. This really helped to create a lot of the tensions that would really start the Cold War right here. And what happened was in June of 1948, Joseph Stalin decided that he wanted to take control of all of Berlin. And so what he did, he started a blockade of West Berlin. He wanted to get the Allies like France, Britain, and the U.S. out of there and take control of it. And so Stalin and the Soviets in what would later be East Germany began to blockade everything, the roads. They blockaded the railways. You couldn't get out by the railroads. They blockaded any kind of canals, also in that part of the zone. And so basically everything was kind of blocked on the ground between what would be West Germany and what would be East Germany, because Berlin is actually in East Germany, or will be East Germany, is where it's located. So what happened, if you know about this, was that the West decided to respond with what they call the Berlin airlift, which went on from 1948 to 1949. And it lasted about 10 months. Yeah, July 1948 is when it started, all the way to May of 1949. And so what happened was for 10 months, the West, like mostly I think U.S., Britain, etc., flew all these air sorties, like through the air, to deliver, food and supplies, coal, etc., to West Berlin, to prevent Stalin from taking over, Berlin, all of Berlin at that point. And I've got some interesting statistics on it. They flew about something like 200-something thousand sorties, like back and forth between West Berlin between West Germany and West Berlin, going back and forth. They delivered, by the way, close to 4 million tons of aid. That's a lot, which they say when they calculate how far they went back and forth, it was equivalent to something like flying like 92 million miles, which you could probably fly to the sun and back, which is pretty amazing. And that picture you're looking at there, the plane coming in, is considered one of the most famous pictures ever taken of that time, of course, with the Berlin airlift. And I think that's considered like one of the first famous pictures you actually see during the Cold War. It's in black and white, but it's considered one of the first famous pictures associated with the Cold War here. Of course, that incident, with the whole, Berlin blockade and the airlift basically caused a lot of mistrust between the West and the East. And so one of the things that happened after, of course, this incident, the West decided to look to, the United States and other powers, and they formed, the Western powers, if you know about it, formed what eventually became the North American Treaty Organization. That's not right. It's North Atlantic is what it should be. Yeah, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Let me fix that as a typo. And the NATO, as they called it for short, called it NATO, was founded in 1949. It even had its own military force, which I think originally was led by Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was actually the supreme commander of it. And it included all the different powers in the West, like United States, Canada, Western Europe. Do have a picture of all, like a map showing you all the countries that were in it at one point. Let me see if I can find it, which is right here. And you can see here that, Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, Belgium, Netherlands, West Germany, Italy, Austria, Norway, Denmark, Greece, and Turkey. And of course, the United States and Canada also as well. So all those are included, of course, in it. And of course, what happened, if you know about this, so you've got that form first. What happens is it causes the Soviets later, a few years later, to form their own alliance, which was later called the Warsaw Pact, this Warsaw Alliance, founded in Warsaw, Poland, 1955. These included mostly the Eastern Bloc countries that, of course, ended up, being all communist, which you see in red. All the countries, of course, that were, of course, part of this were, I think, eventually about 8 of them that would be in it. And those were basically all of these: Soviet Union, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Albania, Bulgaria, and of course, Romania. So all those at one point were in it. Believe it or not, Yugoslavia, which you see there in yellow, was actually communist too. Remember on this ruler named Tito, you may have heard of, and but he was aligned with the West. Tito hated Joseph Stalin and just didn't like him, and so it's one of the odd things about the Cold War, where Yugoslavia kind of, aligned with the West instead. All right. Now, the next thing I need to talk about, of course, that happened in the Cold War era is, let me get to it right here, what I need to talk about. So we talked about that. I need to talk about the 1948 presidential election. I think it's something I haven't got to yet. So we kind of go back and talk about in America what's going on now at the beginning of the Cold War era. And in the presidential election of 1948, you had Harry S. Truman run for re-election for like a second term at that point. Like I said, Truman was, of course, a president. He was from Missouri. He was the 34th president. And originally, of course, he had been the vice president of Franklin D. Roosevelt when he died in office in April of 1945. So that's how he got into power. And Truman was actually not very popular. I don't know if you know this or not, but a lot of people didn't like him. But later, he proves to be a pretty good president. That's one thing that's weird about Truman. He's one of these guys that, I guess, his age has come, up to modern times here. But people think now he did pretty good for some of the things he did, especially at the beginning of the Cold War and all that. And if you know much about this election, the 1948 presidential election is one of the greatest upsets in American presidential elections history. He ran against this guy named Thomas Dewey of New York, who was the governor of New York, who was Republican, and he was very popular. A lot of people wanted Dewey to be elected. And one of the things that happened that almost they think allowed Truman to win was that one of the things that Truman put into the Democratic platform, their plank basically, was an idea on civil rights to help out African Americans and give them equal rights and things like that. They actually were the first to do that, the Democrat Party. And it caused some of the Democrats, in the South to walk out, if you know about that. And of course, some of the Southerners formed this party for like a short third-term party that was called the Dixiecrat Party, which you may have heard of, which was founded by Strom Thurmond, who was from South Carolina. He was kind of, by the way, a strong segregationist. Anyway, so it caused a lot of people, it led to Truman having a lot of support gone, lost because of that in the South. So yeah, Truman was one of the first to actually support some ideas of desegregation in the country. And if you know about it, Truman was the one that desegregated the military. Like the U.S. military was actually desegregated starting in the late 40s, 48, 49, I think when they started segregating it. And so after that, like the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, all get segregated, and that'll later lead to desegregation spreading elsewhere, throughout the country. But yeah, the Dixiecrats were, a big Southern pro-segregationist political party. That's pretty much what they were. A lot of people think that that's what caused the Democratic Party to kind of split in the South. And so you start seeing a lot of Southern whites leaving the Democratic Party and going over to the Republican Party. This kind of takes place over a period of like 20 years or so, from like the 1960s to the 1980s, from like the time of, Truman up through Eisenhower. And of course, Nixon and Reagan were the ones that really got a lot of the white Southerners to really, join the Republican Party and all that. And so the whole Solid South ended. And so after that, the South pretty much, eventually by the late 60s, of course, stops voting Democrat. But Truman won a close election, which it wasn't as close in the Electoral College, but I think the popular votes were close. But a lot of the newspapers got it wrong. A lot of newspapers, of course, said that that Dewey had won the election. There's one that, of course, is famous that the Chicago Daily Tribune printed right here: Dewey defeats Truman, and so Truman kind of shows, that newspaper. And that became also a very famous picture, by the way, taken, I guess, at the beginning of the Cold War era too. At that time after the post-war period. So Truman's going to stay in office, of course, until 1953. All right, let's also talk about more stuff about, the Cold War and, of course, dealing with like the spread and, of course, fear of communism that becomes a big thing. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to talk about this, about I'll go back and almost forgot about it, about Truman. Truman did have some domestic policies. I guess I'll mention briefly about. They were called the Fair Deal. I don't know if you've heard about that. The Fair Deal was a series of reform programs that Truman came up with that were kind of a continuation of the New Deal. So if you remember correctly, they had, Teddy Roosevelt had the Square Deal. You had, FDR with the New Deal. So Truman now had the Fair Deal. And some of it kind of passed. And then, of course, I think some of the ones like the Republicans and Southern Democrats didn't like some of his reforms either. I know desegregation was one thing he was trying to do as well, I think somewhat, but it didn't happen at that time. But I do have some examples that it did do. The Fair Deal extended some Social Security benefits. So under Truman, about 10 million people were able to get Social Security benefits. They also raised like minimum wage rates and set like certain rates, of course, in certain industries. Also under Truman, they began to build a lot of housing because after World War II ended, there was a big shortage of housing in the United States. I think they built like something like 800,000 houses, which I think still wasn't enough. It was all built like in a period of like around 5 or 6 years in the country. And he did some other policies. I think he did some stuff in like civil service and so on, but some of his policies didn't really work out like they should have because of the fact that a lot of the Congress was was controlled by, Republicans who were kind of against it. All right. Now let me go ahead and move on and talk about, like I said, about the fear of and spread of communism, which is, of course, a big thing that happened, of course, in the Cold War. In the late 1940s and the early 1950s, the United States went through a paranoia period where there was a fear that communism was going to take over the United States or take over the world. This became known as the so-called Second Red Scare. Some people called it Mccarthyism. I think it was another nickname. They dubbed it as well. And a lot of the fears started because of a bunch of reasons. One, of course, was the Soviet Union, was taking over Eastern Europe. Was one thing. So basically from East Germany to Russia, everything was communist. Later, also, I get into it, but also in Asia, you have the spread of communism as well, like China, North Korea, later Vietnam, go communist over time. Soviets also exploded the first atomic bomb as well. So they got the atomic bomb too as well. Later, both sides, I don't have it in there, but both sides later get the hydrogen bomb. I think by 1952, 53, that also creates a lot of fear of nuclear war breaking out. Later, they even had the space race. That'll be in the 50s later, but the space race will start in the late 50s, and that helped also create a lot of fear between us and, of course, the Soviets as well, communists. Now, if you know about it, under Truman's administration, there were cases where hundreds of thousands of people were actually investigated for being communist or even having communist ties, whether it be in the government, society, or even in the military. And what happened was, over time, there was like this witch hunt that began in the late 40s and especially in the early 1950s overall. And there were several cases where this actually happened. And they were actually, they think, maybe communists that may have been in the government at one point. I think now they think they definitely were some for sure. And one of the first things that happened that's very famous, I think I've got a picture of that to show you. There was an incident with this guy named Alger Hiss, the Alger Hiss case that came out in 1950. What was that about? Well, apparently in 1949, a former member of the American Communist Party, his name was Whittaker Chambers. I guess he had left the communist step. He wasn't a communist anymore, but he came forward about information about Alger Hiss, who had worked in the U.S. State Department. I don't think he worked there anymore, but he basically was accused of being a communist spy for the Soviet Union. And so he went before, Congress, and of course was accused of this, and it later led to a trial, of course, where he was grilled by members of Parliament, including, you see there in that picture there, Richard Nixon, who was a senator, later vice president under Eisenhower. He basically grilled him about this. And he wasn't found guilty of being communist, but he was found guilty of lying about something, perjury. And eventually went to prison, but I think he served 2 terms. I think he ended up only really doing about 3 to 4 years. But they're not sure if he was really guilty of being a spy. It's still debated today about whether Alger Hiss really was a spy or not. They did find some papers that supposedly were associated with him, where he had gotten some pictures of some kind of State Department secret papers that were about 65 pages. And they were on a microfilm that was found in a pumpkin. And so they were later nicknamed the Pumpkin Papers. Kind of funny. But they're still not sure if he really, was really involved in it. Also, if you know about it, Alger Hiss was investigated by this committee in Congress called the House of Un-American Activities Committee, called different names. HUAC, H-U-A-C, I think is usually sometimes the acronym for it. And what it was this investigative committee that formed around 1950. I think it may have founded in the 1940s, actually originally, late 40s. It was around from close to 1950 up to like the 1970s, and basically investigated people for having ties to communism or even fascism, I think, as well. And a lot of people would go before the committee, and if you know what they would do, is that if they would basically sit there and say, "Are you a communist? Are you a communist? Have you ever known anybody as a communist?" And of course, people would go, "I take the Fifth Amendment." "Are you a communist?" "I take the Fifth Amendment." They keep doing that, of course. But of course, it made them, seem guilty, that they didn't want to talk about it. And so, people thought they were communists anyway. A lot of people that of course went before this committee, if you know about it, a lot of them were literally banned or blackballed in some of their careers. Like there was cases where some actors, I think in Hollywood, I think at one point had been part of the American Communist Party, and they couldn't get work anymore as an actor or director. That happened a bunch of times with several people. Also, J. Robert Oppenheimer was somehow got in trouble for, I don't know what exactly, but I think they say he may have somehow either knew communists or may have been somehow associated with the American Communist Party. They revoked his, he couldn't look at any more secret projects or anything. His secret code clearance was taken away from it. So, Then they had this other incident that's very famous during the Cold War era, dealing with the whole Red Scare thing. They had the story of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, which you may have heard about, and his husband and wife. And if you know about it, they were accused of spying for the Soviet Union, where they supposedly got some kind of atomic secrets and some other stuff. I think they gave like secrets, like radar secrets, to the Soviets, and something to do with sonar or something like that. They gave a bunch of information that they got supposedly from not them, but from like David Greenglass, who had, I think, worked for, I want to say he worked at Los Alamos or somewhere, I believe it was. And that was, Greenglass was Ethel's brother. So that's basically the Julius's, I guess, brother-in-law. And they got arrested for it in 1950, I believe it is, and eventually went to trial. And if you know what happened, they were found guilty and they were executed, both of them, in 1953 for spying for the Soviet Union via the electric chair you see there. They're both killed for it. And they're not sure if Ethel was really guilty. I think there's some people think that she kind of maybe didn't know about it or went along with her husband. They're not sure exactly, but they think Julius Rosenberg was the one that actually got the information and gave it to the Soviets or whatever. Well, they both got the death penalty, of course, for it. Then the peak, if you study about, of the whole Red Scare thing, the whole peak of it, of course, is initiated by Joseph McCarthy. You've probably heard of him before. He's very famous at the beginning of the Cold War. And basically what happened was around 1950, Joseph McCarthy, who was a Republican senator from Wisconsin, began accusing people of being communists throughout, in the United States, like in the government and other places. And so McCarthy began having these hearings, which, believe it or not, ended up on TV, which is famous. They had these live television broadcasts where basically they grilled people about whether they're a communist or not. And so the term Mccarthyism came about because of it, which Mccarthyism is a term that basically meant that it was kind of like a witch hunt. And it's often been compared to, I think, the Salem witch trials or something like that. And so lots of people were accused, like in the government, in society, people like famous people, actors and things like that. They brought before his committee. It was it's not the same thing as the House of Un-American Activities Committee. It's sometimes confused with that. It was a separate, that one was in the House. And this of course, committee had, was basically, these hearings were in the Senate that they had. And I think what caused his like demise was he started to try to go after the military, because he started saying, hey, there's communists in the military too, also as well. And of course, Dwight Eisenhower, who was the president by that time, by 1953, got pretty angry about that. And so the Senate eventually censored him because he was, I guess, going too far with this witch hunt, more or less. McCarthy later died of alcoholism. He had a problem with drinking a lot. And so, but a lot of historians now think that McCarthy was on to something, that there were communists in the government, etc. And so he's actually been vindicated now. Some people think there's still communists in this country that are around, maybe in the government, I don't know, whatever. They think they still have, of course, Antifa you see all the time, communists and anarchists. They still got them, more or less. And it seems to be more like normalized or something now today. But back then, if you were a communist, that was a bad thing, All right. So anyway, kind of talking about that. Now, let me get into, now the fear of communism, of course, kept going, if you know about it. And of course, another thing that happened to, really allow that as well was Asia. Asia started going communist too, as well. And what happened was China, North Korea, those are like the first two states that really go communist, pretty much communist nations in Asia. And at first, you had in 1949 the People's Republic of China formed. This formed after the Chinese Civil War came to an end. The Chinese Civil War was this war between basically those that were Republican Chinese that were in China and those that were communist that were in China. The Republic of China was led by Chiang Kai-shek, who I've talked about before. And then, of course, the other ones I'll get to later. The guy that led communist China was Mao Zedong. And what happened was Chiang Kai-shek's forces got defeated and they got kicked off the mainland. They were actually forced to flee in 1949. They fled to an island called Formosa, which they later called Taiwan. And that actually helps to create some tensions in the Cold War because if you know about what happened at the beginning of the Cold War, for a long time in the UN, they only recognized Taiwan as being China. In fact, you'll often see it written as, you'll see it called Taiwan, and you'll see in parentheses ROC. I've never seen that before, which means Republic of China. And so that happened for a while, and then eventually they recognized China, and then China eventually took its seat, of course, eventually. But that became kind of a controversy, at the beginning of the Cold War. Like I said, Mao Zedong, he was the guy that, of course, was the leader of the Chinese Communists. He's the one that founded it, of course, in 1949. That included their capital of Beijing, of course, where they ruled from. And Mao Zedong was a controversial ruler. He really, if you know about it, converted China into this collectivized state where he tried to collectivize all the people, all the peasants. He was known for this cultural revolution, which both those eventually killed a lot of people. I think they say close to 40 million people may have died in China because of their policies, especially the collectivization, which led to a lot of famines and so on. Let me go ahead and move on and talk about one more thing, I think, and that's probably it for today. I don't know if I'll be able to get anything else after that, but let me also talk about what happened, of course, with Korea as well, which is, of course, another major conflict that really happened at the beginning of the Cold War over Asia. And in America, there was a theory that became popular in the 50s and 60s called the Domino Theory, which you may have heard about. It's this belief that if one country in Asia went communist, it would go communist, all of them in that region, like in a domino effect. And so the same thing they say happened in North Korea, when basically North Korea became communist. A lot of it had to do with Soviet and Chinese influences, as you know. And so around 1948 or 49, somewhere around that time, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was founded, which is called now North Korea, with the capital at Pyongyang. And what happened was after World War II, Japan had controlled it originally, Korea going back to the early 1900s. And so Japan withdrew from the Korean Peninsula. In the Soviet Union, the U.S. began to create separate states that were opposite of each other. On one side, you had North Korea, the North Korean state, and it was communist. It was founded by this dictator and his family named Kim Il-sung, the Kim family, which the current ruler, Kim Il-jung, that's his grandfather, that founded, of course, that state. And then, of course, you've got the South Korea, or what they call the Republic of Korea. It was founded also around 1948 as well. It became more democratic, capitalist type state, which it still is today. And it's heavily aligned with the United States, if you know about that, and still is today. And its capital is at Seoul, which it still is. They had, of course, a president, of course, that rules, of course, still over South Korea. And the first president of South Korea was Syngman Rhee, who ruled, I think, up to close to 1960 or so. I do have a map showing you like the two states. Both the two states, by the way, were divided around the 38th parallel, which you can see right here. It shows kind of the map of the Korean War, of course, later that will break out. And what happened was the reason why the Korean War, well, by the way, I'll kind of put that up on the screen for you for later, but that's where it split, of course, 38th parallel, which is, of course, still is today. But the reason why the Korean War broke out was because they think that Joseph Stalin egged on the North Koreans to invade South Korea, to make it all communist in that region, like one communist Korean state, which you see there. And like North Korean forces were actually backed up by Soviet like military equipment, like tanks and so on. And so the North Koreans were able to use Soviet equipment basically to rout South Korea, take their capital of Seoul, and march down to the bottom of the peninsula, which you can see there, in where Pusan is on the bottom to the southeast part of it. What happened was it caused the United Nations to come in and intervene because there's a fear that, this might create World War III or something like that. They also want to save South Korea. And so what happens, the UN intervenes and they get the backing of the United States, which puts up, I want to say 90% of the forces that fought actually in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. And so they bring in Douglas MacArthur, who was, at that point in working on the occupation of Japan for its redevelopment. And so MacArthur comes up with this brilliant plan to attack the west coast of South Korea to do an amphibious assault where Incheon is, which is right here in the map. Incheon, so they attack here using the Navy right here on this west coast here. And what happens is the UN side is able to, they seize the west coast. What happens, it forces the North Koreans to retreat back to the north. And so from there, we actually march northward, the UN does. They seize Pyongyang. They take the capital of North Korea, but they don't stop there. They keep going northward at that point. And that's when problems started, of course, if you know about it, in the Korean War. And what happened was the Chinese entered the war at that point, which caused the war to really change course. And actually, the UN force got driven back down the peninsula, if you know about it. In the north, and China actually retook Seoul again. Crazy. That happened, of course. And eventually, drive them back up. I think we study about it later, by 1953. But eventually, the Korean War stalemates with neither side really being able to win it, more or less. And the casualties on both sides were really high, by the way. Now, by the way, one thing about that happened at the end, or at least at the beginning of the Korean War, it's famous. If you know about it, President Truman fired Douglas MacArthur for insubordination because he wanted to use nuclear weapons on China when they came into the war to help to try to stop them. And they were worried that this would cause World War III. And so they had to replace him. And so MacArthur was forced to come back to the United States and all of that. And MacArthur became famous for this retirement speech he gave in front of Congress, where he said that soldiers never die, they just fade away. I think it was his famous quote. But he was a popular guy, MacArthur, but I think the firing was unpopular, but a lot of historians think that that could have been almost World War III, if he would have used those nukes. And probably the first example of that during the Cold War, when we almost had, of course, World War III happen. By the way, the Korean War would last until 1953. It wouldn't really end until Dwight Eisenhower came in and became president. And he would help to, end the ceasefire, but they never really ended the war. The Korean War was never ended. And if you know about it, in the Korean Peninsula, they still have a DMZ set up between both sides. And so the Korean conflict is kind of still ongoing today, pretty much. So that's where I'm going to stop for now, lecture-wise. Of course, I will be talking about next week a continuation. This is kind of like a part 2 I'll have later, of course, on the beginning of the Cold War. I'll talk about the 50s, what happened, because a lot of things happened in the 50s, mostly under President Dwight Eisenhower. We'll get into that. And if I have any time, I'll move on. I don't know if I will or not, but I'll move on to the 1960s, probably sometime, maybe next week as well. So that's it for today. Overall, by the way, before I go, remind you, don't forget about certain assignments I have up. Of course, I've got the second exam, which will expire this Saturday, November 7th. And don't forget about the new Canvas quiz I put up that I got about the New Deal and World War II as well. So y'all have a good weekend coming up. And that's it for this, pretty much this week as lecture-wise. So take care.